Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we've got another video in our series of World War II battles. This time, it's the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. The Allied forces have been moving steadily north in the Central Solomons for about a year now, and they've finally reached the northern end of the Solomon Islands. They're launching an invasion of Bougainville, which has a series of Japanese airfields on it, concentrated to the north and south of the island. Admiral Halsey has decided, instead of attacking either end of the island where the Japanese forces are concentrated, he's going to invade the middle of the island and have the Seabees bulldoze an American airfield right there. This is all part of Operation Cartwheel, which is the American and Australian, New Zealand, the Allied plan to isolate Rabaul, which is a major Japanese fleet base in this area. It's heavily defended, and the Allies would rather neutralize it, surround it, and then bypass it, as opposed to launching an amphibious invasion. On November 1st, 1943, Allied troops go ashore on Bougainville. The Japanese immediately throw together a pickup force of cruisers and destroyers under the command of Admiral Omari. This is very similar to what they did during the Battle of Savo Island when the Americans invaded Guadalcanal over a year earlier. Many of the major surface warships of Admiral Halsey's fleet have already been withdrawn for a future invasion in the Central Pacific. And so his invasion forces are only protected by 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers. All of these ships, however, are brand new and equipped with radar. The cruisers are all Cleveland class, 10,000-ton light cruisers, each one armed with 12 rapid-firing 6-inch guns and 12 5-inch guns. Cleveland-class light cruisers are some of the best cruisers fielded during World War II. They are inferior to their Japanese counterparts in that they rely solely on gunfire and do not have any torpedoes to speak of. However, this also means they don't have torpedoes to explode on deck. These ships are part of a design philosophy that faster firing 6-inch guns can be even more deadly than the slower, heavier 8-inch guns of heavy cruisers. The Clevelands are the same weight as heavy cruisers, whether American or Japanese. However, instead of having 9 or 10 8-inch guns, they have the 12 6-inch guns and 12 5-inch guns. They can't engage the enemy at quite as long a range, but at the ranges they can engage at, they can smother a target with fire, and their lighter shells, especially against cruiser and destroyer armor, are still going to do significant damage, and the sheer volume of them are going to overwhelm an enemy. Again, these ships are completely modern and have all of the latest electronics, and by this point the U.S. Navy has tested, trained with, and trusts their radar technologies. The Clevelands do have one drawback, and that is their top weight. They cannot continue to have electronics and anti-aircraft guns added indefinitely. And so by the end of World War II, they'll be kind of constrained. But at this point in the mid-war, they're relatively new and entirely state-of-the-art. The 8 destroyers are all members of the Fletcher class, the largest class of destroyers ever built. They're armed with 10 21-inch torpedo tubes and 5 single-mount 5-inch guns. These ships are, I'd argue, the best destroyers in the world in 1943. They have heavy firepower, they have heavy torpedo power, they're state-of-the-art modern, and again, armed with their own electronics. And the fact that all of these American ships are homogeneous, they have the same speed, the same firepower, the same support system, and they have all trained together, really gives the U.S. an advantage here. The Japanese, on the other side, have a mixed force. They have some of the pre-war, theoretically treaty-limited heavy cruisers, a pair of them. They have a pair of light cruisers, one relatively modern and the other interwar era, more of a World War I design. None of the Japanese light cruisers during World War II really compare to the American light cruisers. Again, the American light cruisers are basically the same size and weight as heavy cruisers, and the Japanese light cruisers are more, they're not necessarily enlarged destroyers, but they are destroyer leaders as opposed to gunships in their own right. The Japanese bring 6 destroyers, and they'll have approximately 100 aircraft involved in this fight. So the two fleets are relatively well balanced. The American fleet has more ships. Their light cruisers definitely outclass their Japanese counterparts. The Japanese heavy cruisers are arguably better ships than the American Clevelands with their torpedo armaments and their 8-inch guns. In the balance, that they come out pretty equal. The Americans have 2 extra destroyers, and the destroyers are all of top-notch quality. This is probably one of the most evenly matched fights of the war. And it's at night, which was once the Japanese home turf, and the Japanese are attacking. They've got some control over the engagement. The Americans know that the Japanese are coming, and so they're able to disperse the transport ships and get their fleet out at sea. And the Japanese know the Americans are going to be there, so they're ready for a fight too. Both sides, more or less, form up in the same sort of formation. With the Americans, you've got the 4 cruisers in a line in the center. That's their gun line. And then they have the destroyers divided into 2 divisions of 4, one on each side. One of the divisions is commanded by Admiral Arleigh Burke. At this point, I believe he's still a captain. He's one of the most aggressive American destroyer commanders. The American cruisers, if I haven't said so already, are commanded by Admiral Aaron Merrill. On the Japanese side, again, they take a similar formation. They have their 2 heavy cruisers in the center as their gun line, and then they have a light cruiser and 3 destroyers on each wing. The American ships with their radar are able to spot the Japanese, and they dispatch one of their wings of destroyers to go and launch torpedoes, while the rest of the fleet maneuvers out of the way in case the Japanese have launched torpedoes. The Americans have learned their lessons about long-lance torpedoes. On the Japanese side, they spot the American ships and do launch torpedoes and are able to maneuver away from Japanese torpedoes. Unlike earlier battles, torpedoes would not play a major part in this one. Both sides knowing they're coming, they were able to maneuver out of the way. One American ship, the destroyer Foote, did have her stern hit by a single torpedo, and she was the lone severely damaged American destroyer. On the Japanese side, they didn't take any American torpedoes. Having maneuvered and failed to hit with torpedoes, the 2 columns close for a gunfight, and the American ships relying on radar are able to open fire with their rapid-fire guns and score hits on a number of enemy ships. In the end, the American gunnery will sink a Japanese light cruiser and a destroyer, which was disabled and then sunk later on in the battle. One of the Japanese heavy cruisers would be damaged in a collision. One of the Japanese light cruisers would be damaged, and 2 of the Japanese destroyers would be very badly damaged. On the American side, the Japanese were basically being fired on unanswered for 15 or 20 minutes before they were able to find the range of the American ships. And they were able to score gunnery hits on one American light cruiser. And a couple of the American destroyers did collide. Even with radar and IFF, identification friend or foe, the American ships maneuvering all over the battlefield had trouble recognizing friend from foe, and it caused them to miss opportunities when they could have fired on Japanese ships for fear that they would be firing on their own ships, and it did cause them to fire ineffectually on their own ships on occasion. Some American ships that dropped out of the line then became subject to fire from their own side because they were no longer protected by the formation. They weren't where they were supposed to be. This happened either through navigational errors or through battle damage, as in Foote's case. The Japanese, of course, are maneuvering at night without any of those electronic sensors, and even though they're really well trained at it, accidents happen, and the collision seriously caused issues for them. And they were operating at a slower speed than planned because one of their cruisers had been hit by American aircraft before the battle. Admiral Omari believed, possibly because the Clevelands looked like they were on fire from firing their guns so much, that he had scored hits all up and down the American cruiser column. He believed he was fighting heavy cruisers because of the volume of fire he was receiving. And as daylight approached, he didn't want his force to be caught out in the open by enemy aircraft, and so he retreated. He did not, in fact, inflict any significant damage, and the Japanese lose this battle. They do not complete any of their objectives, and they take significantly higher losses than they're able to inflict. The American formation, instead of retreating, stays in the area. They remain in control of the battlefield, and they're able to sink any Japanese damaged ships that aren't able to leave, and they're able to protect their own damaged ships. The Japanese launch an airstrike of about 100 aircraft in the morning to attack the American ships, and the American anti-aircraft fire is able to drive them away, destroying about a quarter of the attacking force without taking any significant damage. They also were protected by land-based combat air patrols. So, this battle is an American victory, but the Japanese aren't going to give up Bougainville that easily. They've been holding their forces in reserve, waiting for the Americans to get closer to Rabaul. So now they dispatch a powerful and cohesively trained cruiser force to Rabaul to then go and attack the American supply lines. Admiral Halsey, not for the first time in the Solomon Islands campaign, finds himself with very few forces to throw in to plug the gap. So you'll have to tune in next time for our battle to see what happens with this second Japanese cruiser force they're going to throw against Empress Augusta Bay. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section down below. If you would like to support the museum and our YouTube channel, check the description down below for a link to our Gofundme campaign. Anything you donate into that comes directly back into the YouTube channel and allows me to keep creating content for you. The museum does receive operating support from the New Jersey Department of State. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you're notified when we put out new content. We do try to put out new content multiple times a week. And thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.